Imagine spending your entire life being introduced as someone else's sister. Every room you walk into, every party, every newspaper article, every television interview. This is Lee, Jackie's sister. Not Lee Bouvier, not Lee Radziwill, not the woman who spoke 4 languages, who dressed better than anyone in Europe, who was called the most elegant woman in the world by people who had seen them both. Just Jackie's sister. For 85 years, Caroline Lee Bouvier lived one of the most extraordinary lives of the 20th century. She was a princess, a socialite, an interior designer, an actress, a fashion icon, a friend to Andy Warhol, Truman Capote, Rudolf Nureyev, and Mick Jagger. She traveled the world on private yachts. She danced at Studio 54. She sat in the front row at every fashion show that mattered. And when she died, alone in her Manhattan apartment, in February 2019, the headline in every single newspaper on Earth read the same way. Lee Radziwill, Jackie Kennedy's younger sister, dies at 85. This is her story, not Jackie's story. Hers. And it is far more heartbreaking than anyone ever knew. To understand Lee, you must first understand the world she was born into and the sister she was born alongside. Caroline Lee Bouvier entered the world on March 3, 1933, in Southampton, New York. She was the second daughter of John Blackjack Bouvier III, a Wall Street stockbroker of extraordinary charm and equally extraordinary recklessness, and Janet Lee Bouvier, a woman of fierce social ambition and iron discipline. Her sister Jacqueline, Jackie, was born 4 years earlier in 1929. From the very beginning, the two girls were different. Jackie was serious, bookish, intense. She read voraciously, studied languages, and carried herself with gravity that made adults pay attention. She had dark, wide-set eyes and a stillness about her that drew people in. Lee was lighter, more playful, more beautiful, some said, though this was always a dangerous thing to say in the Bouvier household. She had softer features, more warmth, more laughter. Where Jackie observed, Lee charmed. Where Jackie studied, Lee dazzled. They adored each other. They fought constantly. They were, in the way of sisters everywhere, each other's greatest admirer and most devastating critic. Their father adored them both, but Jackie was his favorite. He called her "My Jax." He saved his deepest conversations for her. In a family where paternal attention was a currency everyone competed for, Jackie had the most of it. Lee noticed, she always noticed, their parents' marriage collapsed when Lee was 7 years old. Blackjack Bouvier's drinking, his gambling, his serial infidelities. Janet had endured enough. The divorce was bitter and public, as divorces in New York society always were. Their mother remarried in 1942, a wealthy man named Hugh Auchincloss, who brought with him a large estate in Virginia called Marywood and another in Newport called Hammersmith Farm. The girls were suddenly living in a different world entirely. One of horses and butlers and summer parties on the lawn. Lee attended Miss Porter's school in Connecticut, the same boarding school as Jackie, though a few years behind. Then on to Sarah Lawrence College, briefly. Then, and this was typical of Lee, she left. Academic life was not what interested her. The world was what interested her. People, style, beauty, experience. At 18, she moved to New York and began working as an assistant at Harper's Bazaar under the legendary Diana Vreeland. She was paid almost nothing, but she was in the rooms that mattered. At 19, she married her first husband, Michael Canfield, an adopted son of publisher Cass Canfield. It was glamorous. It was doomed. It lasted 5 years. By 1958, Lee's first marriage was over, and the world was about to change in ways neither sister could have imagined. In 1960, John F. Kennedy won the presidency of the United States, and Lee's sister Jackie became the most famous woman on earth. Overnight, everything shifted. The Bouvier sisters, who had grown up side by side, were now separated by an invisible but absolute line. On one side, Jackie, First Lady, global icon, the woman the world was watching. On the other, Lee, her sister, her companion, her shadow. Lee handled it with grace. Publicly, privately, those close to her saw something else. A woman struggling to define herself in a world that had suddenly decided her primary identity was relational, defined not by who she was, but by who her sister had married. She threw herself into her own life with renewed urgency. In 1959, just before Kennedy's election, she had met a Polish prince named Stanislaw Stas Radziwill. He was older than her by 22 years. Sophisticated, worldly, wealthy, titled. They married in 1959. Lee became Princess Lee Radziwill, a princess, an actual formal European princess. And yet, even this was immediately overshadowed. When Lee visited the White House to see her sister, the newspapers didn't write about Princess Radziwill. They wrote about Jackie's younger sister visiting from London. She could not escape it. The Radziwills settled in London, in a magnificent townhouse in Buckingham Place. Lee threw herself into decorating it, and discovered a genuine talent. Her eye for interiors was extraordinary. She had an instinct for rooms that felt alive, layered, historically resonant without being stiff. She and Stas had 2 children, Anthony, born in 1960, and Tina, born in 1961. But Lee was restless. The townhouse, the title, the children. It was a beautiful life. Was it her life? And then, in November 1963, the world collapsed. Lee was one of the first people Jackie called after the assassination of President Kennedy in Dallas. She flew to Washington immediately. She stayed at Jackie's side through funeral preparations, through the long procession, through the burial at Arlington. She held her sister's hand through the worst days of their lives. And when the world moved on, Jackie leaned on Lee in ways that would slowly, quietly begin to reshape both their lives. In the mid-1960s, Lee entered perhaps the most vivid chapter of her life. Truman Capote became her closest friend, the brilliant, dangerous, impossibly indiscreet author of In Cold Blood and Breakfast at Tiffany's. Capote was drawn to beautiful, wounded, socially elevated women. He called them his swans, and Lee was his favorite, his princess. He saw in her something that others missed, not just beauty and style, but a peculiar kind of suffering, the suffering of a woman who was deeply talented and perpetually overlooked. Through Capote came Andy Warhol. Through Warhol came the factory, Studio 54, the whole frantic, glittering world of late 1960s New York. Lee was in the middle of all of it. She also fell in love, repeatedly and badly. Rudolf Nureyev, the legendary Russian ballet dancer, became one of her most consuming attachments. Their relationship was intense, complicated, and ultimately impossible. And then there was Aristotle Onassis. Lee had been involved with Onassis first. In 1968, Onassis married Jackie. Friends say Lee never entirely recovered from this, not because she was still in love with him, but because it was yet another moment where the choice had come down to the 2 Bouvier sisters, and the world had chosen Jackie. Again, Lee Radziwill spent the rest of her life reinventing herself. She tried acting. In 1967, she appeared in a television production of Laura. The reviews were merciless, as though critics resented a socialite princess daring to take up space in their world. She tried the stage. Mixed reviews again. The world had decided in advance what she was, and would not allow her to be anything else. She eventually found in interior design the career that suited her best. Drawing on her genuine gift of eye, taste, and historical knowledge, she decorated homes for some of the wealthiest people in the world. But interior design, however brilliant, was not the kind of achievement that made front pages. She divorced Stas in 1974. He died 2 years later. His death hit her hard. He had given her, for all his flaws, a title and a version of herself that had felt entirely her own. She married again Herbert Ross, a film director, in 1988. That marriage lasted 6 years. In her later years, Lee settled into a life that looked, from the outside, like the ideal existence of a cultured, wealthy New York woman. But those who knew her well describe a woman who had quietly, incrementally withdrawn from a world. Jackie died in 1994. The death devastated Lee. Whatever complicated feelings had existed between them, the competition, the comparison, the shadow, none of it mattered at the end. She was my whole world, Lee said afterward. My whole world. Her son Anthony died in 1999 of prostate cancer, At just 40 years old, he was the boy she had raised in London, in the grand house in Buckingham Place, in the years when she had still believed that princesshood and marriage and children were enough. He was 40, she was 66. There is no mathematics for surviving your children. Truman Capote, who had loved her more faithfully than almost anyone, had died in 1984, destroyed by alcohol and the catastrophic social fallout of a novel that had thinly disguised as swans in devastating portraits. Lee had not entirely forgiven him before he died. Another loss with complicated edges. In the last decade of her life, Lee Radziwill was largely invisible to the world that had once photographed her constantly. She gave a remarkable interview late in her life, in which she said something that those who heard it never forgot. I always felt I was fighting for air, not for fame, not for money, not even for love. Exactly. For air, for the simple space to breathe and be seen as herself. For 85 years, she had fought for that air. Sometimes she found it, in a beautifully decorated room, in a dance floor at 3 a.m, in the quiet of her Manhattan apartment. Sometimes she hadn't. On February 15th, 2019, Lee Radziwill died in her Manhattan apartment. She was 85. She had been a princess, a friend to geniuses, a woman who had walked through the defining moments of the 20th century, Dallas, the death of Camelot, the long aftermath of history. And the headline, as she had surely always known it would be, read, Lee Radziwill, Sister Jacqueline Kennedy, dies at 85. There's a photograph of Lee and Jackie, taken sometime in the 1950s, before everything. They are sitting together, laughing at something, the joke lost to time now. Two sisters, two Bouvier girls, two people who started in the same place and were carried, by the currents of history and luck in the men they loved, to entirely different destinations. Jackie became a legend. Lee became a footnote. But here's what the footnote knew, and what the legend could never quite escape. Lee was free in ways Jackie never was. She reinvented herself because she could. She failed publicly because she dared. She loved and walked away from all of it still herself, still standing, still fighting for air. Jackie had the world's love. Lee had her own. The tragedy is not that Lee Radziwill lived in Jackie's shadow. The tragedy is that the world let her. Rest in peace, Lee. You were never just a sister.